Hello everybody and welcome to the movies I watched this month. November has come and gone, and overall, despite a few duds here and there, I was very happy with what I saw. I definitely found some new favourites and can hopefully share them with you today. As a heads up, there will be no major spoilers in this video, so it is safe to watch if you want to check any of these films out. Now, without any further ado, here's what I watched in November 2023. To close out Kieślowski's psychological trilogy, Red tackles the idea of fraternity and what it means to make connections with those around us. After Valentine meets Joseph, she learns of a man who has seemingly given up on humanity. He spies on the phone conversations of strangers, not to do anything with the information or make a profit for himself. He does it because he can. Valentine is obviously resistant to this at first, but as the two spend more time together, they begin to teach each other new ways of thinking and seeing the world. The film's whole ideology seems to stem from the fact that life itself is made up of coincidences. The events of this story only happen because Joseph's dog happened to be walking on that road as Valentine was looking away. She makes a call early on, and another completely unrelated man's telephone rings across the road. Two characters who never meet both happen to be judges who passed their exams in the same unlikely way, and both caught their partners in the act of cheating on them. But despite that, it also insists that we have to make our decisions on how to react to these things. It fully drives home the message of taking control of your own life and making what you want of it. Red manages to balance the intricate story of White with the precise filmmaking of Blue, which works brilliantly not only as the conclusion to this trilogy, but also as Kieślowski's swan song before his untimely passing. So me and the girlfriend got the chance to watch this in 4DX, and hey, it was pretty good. I don't really know what to say. It's Harry Potter. This movie is so charming and has that warm, cozy feeling that you'd expect from a Chris Columbus film. The whole crew did a fantastic job of not only bringing the wizarding world to life, but also in perfectly adapting a story from the page without missing any of the important or interesting details. There isn't a minute of screen time wasted in this. Despite its 2.5-hour length, it's actually a super tight screenplay. The casting is great, despite some of the child actors not quite finding their footing yet and having to overact. The adults are all brilliant in their roles. Maggie Smith, Robbie Coltrane, Richard Griffiths, Richard Harris, Warwick Davis, John Hurt, and of course Alan Rickman all make their characters leap off of the page. Obviously, you can't talk about this series without paying homage to the incredible work of John Williams, who composed one of cinema's most iconic themes for this film. It's definitely a little more camp than the sequels and doesn't have the maturity of later entries, but the magical whimsy is enough to make this one a great watch for any time of year. As someone who never bothered to look into the ever-expanding lore and history of the series, Five Nights at Freddy's is a film that I have to kind of judge as a standalone movie as opposed to an adaptation of a video game. It's nice to see Josh Hutcherson back in movies again, and Matthew Lillard is always fun to watch, but unfortunately with a 1 hour and 49-minute runtime, the thing drags for a good portion in the middle. This wouldn't be so bad if the film was even a little scary, but it never quite manages to get there. I know that the PG-13 rating probably hurt this a little bit, but you have to remember that their game series is targeted towards children, so it obviously is doable. The film finds itself juggling 3 different plot lines: the missing brother, the child custody battle, and the actual Five Nights at Freddy's. The first was actually the most interesting to me and made me wish I was watching a movie about lucid dreaming and pulling repressed details out of one's subconscious mind instead. I was fully on board for that and was left a little disappointed when we inevitably had to go back to the actual point of the movie. The set design was impressively faithful to the game and the animatronics were genuinely really cool, but this is a series that, despite having some detailed lore, is very sparse on plot. And going by this movie, it definitely shows. I've been told a few times over the years that I just don't like romance movies, and I've come to the conclusion that I do, but just the good ones. I can't tell you how many generic rom-coms I've seen over the years, but Before Sunrise is a textbook example of how to do this right. There aren't any genre stereotypes to hold it back, like having to compete against someone else for the other's affection. There's no interfering third party, there's no over-choreographed sex scene, and thank God there's no falling out scene where they have to rekindle what they once had in the final act. It's the fact that Jesse and Celine feel like real people that make this work. They're both down to earth and have realistic conversations about seemingly nothing, but also everything. Jesse's monologue about how reincarnation doesn't make sense when you consider the Earth's population is 5 times denser than it was thousands of years ago is something I can totally imagine people bringing up on a first date. It's nonsense and doesn't mean anything, but it also gives you an insight into how this person thinks. Because the two aren't exactly the same, they do disagree on some things, but they're open and honest enough with each other that they never have to have an easily avoidable blowout. It's genuinely difficult to write a story like this and not have it be sugary or overly sappy. But Before Sunrise isn't solely about getting two attractive people to hook up. Instead, it explores how they find solace in each other through the beauty of everyday life. It's a story about appreciating the moment, and for what it is, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I actually rewatched Her the same night I saw Before Sunrise, so I was clearly not okay on that day. This movie just means an awful lot to me, and makes me feel something that I can't seem to recreate from watching any other movie. I'm not really sure what it is, whether it's an emotion that's new to me, or just a whole bunch of emotions crashing together at once. I don't even know if I like it, but I do know that this is a film that I hold near and dear to my heart. It's essentially about a man who develops a relationship with his computer, and I know that sounds weird, but there's so much more to it than that. It's not just a story about love, it's about overcoming loneliness and trying to discover your place in the world. It's an interesting take on how technology both connects and separates us from each other. It's funny, it's charming, it's sad, happy, and everything in between. I recently uploaded a video dedicated to why I love this movie, so check that one out if you want more of my thoughts. Burning is many things. It's a critique on classism and how the wealthy are often oblivious or even indifferent to the suffering of those deemed beneath them, but it's also a commentary on how we often look for meaning or explanations in things where there simply is none. It's easy to describe Burning as boring because nothing really happens in it, but the fact that nothing really happens in it is exactly what results in the chaos of the climax. So the film is about a young man who takes care of a friend's cat while she goes on holiday to Africa, and when she returns, she's not alone. She brings Ben, a fellow Korean she met at the airport, and the three of them slowly start to spend more time together. Now, the film intentionally leaves a lot of details ambiguous, not just to build tension, but to put us in the shoes of Jong-soo. He takes a slight dislike to Ben when they're first introduced, and while we shouldn't have anything against him ourselves, we distrust him because the film insists that we should. He gets in the way of a developing romance, the cinematography puts the two men at odds with each other, and he seems to just have everything that Jong-soo doesn't. We hate him because Jong-soo does. That's the point of the movie. We don't know whether Ben has any sinister intentions. Everything could easily be explained away, and he was always quite polite, but if you wanted to see things as a sign of guilt, then you easily could. It's Jong-soo's paranoia that takes hold by the end, and this is what I imagine makes the film absolutely fascinating on a rewatch. Dream Scenario is about a man who seemingly appears in everyone's dreams over the span of a few weeks and gets famous because of it. The concept is super intriguing and is what initially drew me to the project, even more than Nick Cage. I really enjoyed how the film satirizes celebrities and internet culture, detailing how people seem to worship things when they're societally relevant, but then cast them aside when they're no longer trendy. It was really interesting because Paul plays up his modesty and pretends not to enjoy the attention he's getting, despite clearly loving every second of it. For the first time in his life, he's not just that guy who blends into the background, but an actual participant in people's lives. Of course, though, he doesn't want to be known exclusively for this one thing that was out of his control to begin with. He has his passion and ambition to become a writer, but his overnight audience are only interested in what they know him for. The comedy was a little hit or miss for me. Maybe this would have worked better as a straight-up surreal drama like Being John Malkovich. There are these internet famous characters that show up in the last act, and they just don't work for me. They took what was initially profound subtext and turned it into a bad parody that detracted from what it was actually trying to do. The sci-fi aspect wasn't something that needed to exist in my eyes, so the film had developed a habit of setting up really interesting ideas and not following through in a satisfying way. I did like the movie, but it could have gone through a few more drafts. It's not very often that you find one of those infinitely quotable movies, especially on a single viewing. Clue is definitely one of those films. I watched this with some friends, and there are so many great lines that stick with you to quote after its runtime. Despite being an American-made film, it oddly feels very British with its absurd humor and subtle gags through body language and facial expressions. The cast is fantastic, with a special nod to Michael McKean, Christopher Lloyd, and of course, Tim Curry. They all do wonders with the screenplay and are just infinitely fun to watch. I suppose that's the biggest takeaway from Clue. The film is famous for having 3 different endings, and despite some being better than others, it doesn't really matter who the killer is. The film is all about enjoying the setup to the degree that the reveal doesn't even matter. If an ending does bother you though, you can always set up another game and do it all over again. Now I'm gonna go home and sleep with my wife. Maybe I'm on my own here, but I don't really understand why this exists. I'm not familiar with the source material, but I know that it was a passion project of David Fincher's that he wanted to make for a while, and honestly, the reason baffles me. I can't exactly slate the man's filmmaking here. The film is undoubtedly well made and moves along at a relatively brisk pace, but nothing about this story stands out as particularly unique or interesting. It's just another one of those best in the world at his job mercenaries who has to go on the run and fight his employers who've turned their backs on him. It's a story we've all seen before and even falls into premise cliche. As I said, the details themselves are fairly well done with good cinematography and a solid performance from Michael Fassbender, but the movie ends up being far weaker than the sum of its parts. It would have been nice to have a day in the repetitive life of a precise and calculated killer. What if the prologue was the whole movie? Imagine a Rear Window type of film where the assassin is scoping out his target for 90 minutes, detailing his methods and process through monologue, and in the climax, he misses, and for the first time, we see him panic. Cut to credits. That's the movie I'd like to see. But instead, I felt lumbered with a disposable Netflix original with a run-of-the-mill plot, albeit a very well-made one. Wow, this was a lot to take in. In what has to be Charlie Kaufman's most honest and rich work to date, there is no way that you'll be able to pick up on all the details packed into Synecdoche, New York on a first viewing. Some films lend themselves to the you have to see it twice trope, but I can easily imagine that I'd still be picking up new details watching this for the 30th time. This is a movie that's sort of impossible to summarize within a short blurb because it's not about any one thing, it's about everything. It details the troubles of health anxiety, the passage of time, one's desire to achieve something, missing your family, maintaining control, and the masks we wear in public, and the ever-repeating cycle of life and death. The film often depicts how time constantly gets away from us through subtle environmental storytelling, as opposed to tying it into the main narrative. The very first scene where Caden and his family have breakfast together spans several weeks, despite it being framed as a single morning. It tackles the concept of identity in interesting ways that get you wondering, how many people do you think know the real you? After all, we're not our name, we're not our face, our family, our hobbies, there's so much more to us than that. But we can never truly know anybody except ourselves. We often wear masks that we think other people will like in a sad attempt to be loved, when in reality, we're all quite different from each other. There's no way I can break down all the elements, themes, and little details of the movie here, there's simply too much to go over, but that's what makes Synecdoche, New York such a brilliant conversation piece. You'll literally never run out of things to talk about when discussing it, and hey, maybe in future I'll try and make a dedicated video explaining my thoughts, but for now, all I can say is, this is a masterpiece. I was worried that Before Sunset was going to lose some of the charm of the first film, but luckily it managed to keep that sense of authenticity that Sunrise had nailed down. When Jesse and Celine meet here 9 years after their last encounter, they're both older and more mature people. They're still recognizable as the characters they once were, but have been fleshed out in a way that clearly demonstrates the growth they've gone through over the last decade. Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy both continue to add a detailed nuance to their performances and deliver some of the most painfully accurate to life dialogue in cinema. You can't help but want these two to get together because they likely remind you of yourself or someone else you know. While it is nice to catch up with these two and see what their lives became after the events in Vienna, I don't really know what this movie accomplishes. Like I said, I appreciate how they've both grown as people, and maybe that's the point, to see whether they're still suited after 9 years of growth, but the sentimentalist in me would have liked for their reunion to be left to interpretation. That's not necessarily a fault of this film in and of itself, but the consequences of making a sequel, period. There was something magical in that one night only thing that Before Sunrise managed to capture so beautifully. For what it is though, I did enjoy this film, and I'm looking forward to the next one. David Lynch always intends for his projects to act as an entirely unique experience for every person who watches it, so we can all pull our own meanings and interpretations, and Eraserhead is no different. For example, I see the movie as the projection of a man's fear and anxiety of becoming a father. Whether it's down to the newfound responsibility of it all, or perhaps the internalized disgust of how nature works, it's clear to me that the baby is everything that petrifies Henry about parenthood. I know some people pull some subtext on industrialization and its effects on society, which isn't something that came to my head, but that doesn't make it any less valid of an interpretation. As you'd expect from Lynch, the film is very abstract in its performances, visuals, and sound design. For all we know, it's set in then contemporary 1970s Philadelphia, but there's something about it that makes it feel as if it's in a different universe. It's how it feels to be trapped in a nightmare with things familiar enough to appear genuine, but the rules and consistencies of reality simply don't apply. It functions as a vessel for the macabre thoughts that we often bury deep within ourselves, only to have the dehumanizing and uncomfortable reality come bubbling to the surface anyway. The film is undoubtedly effective at what it's trying to do, but simply doesn't hold up to some of Lynch's later work in my eyes. It's certainly an interesting conversation piece, but it's difficult for me to truly care and get invested in these characters the same way I did with Jeffrey Beaumont or Laura Palmer. Maybe a rewatch would change my mind, but as of now, Eraserhead is a movie that's more fun to think about than it is to watch. Django Unchained is a little difficult for me to figure out where exactly I sit with it. On one hand, it's super well crafted with painstaking attention to detail in the screenplay and set design. On the other, it's not one of Tarantino's more compelling stories to me. Don't get me wrong, the snappy dialogue and masterful cinematography make for a film that is wonderful to behold, both in its more action-oriented sequences and the quieter character moments. The performances from cast members like Samuel L. Jackson and Christoph Waltz are pretty great, but it's definitely Leonardo DiCaprio's portrayal of Calvin Candie that steals the show. He's so spiteful and detestable, yet also deceptively charming in a way that you never quite feel comfortable in his presence. This might also be Tarantino's most effective use of blood in a movie, except for perhaps Reservoir Dogs. I suppose my biggest issue with the film though is how Django himself feels relegated to a supporting character in his own movie. Dr. Schultz is by far a more complex, engaging, and interesting character, so the film starts to drag when he's not on screen. The action sequences are exciting and well choreographed, but with the exception of the shootout at the end and the dinner scene in Candyland, not much of this movie stands out in my memory. The trailer for Saltburn was incredible, because I was so excited to watch this despite having no idea what it was even about. Once again, Barry Keoghan steals the show as Oliver, a young man who makes friends with a rich student at Oxford University, and is then invited to his family's mansion for the summer. It's hard to appreciate why at first, but Oliver is a pretty unsettling guy who manages to keep you on edge for reasons you don't fully understand. He's hardly imposing physically, but Keoghan does a fantastic job of portraying someone who always seems like they have something over you. As well as Oliver, the whole cast of characters here are all really well fleshed out, feeling like real, tangible people, which makes the whole series of events to come all the more upsetting. The film has some of the year's most stylish visuals, with everything framed in such a grand and striking way, it's as if we're being invited into Saltburn ourselves, making certain sequences later on all the more awkward to watch. I suppose my biggest complaint is that I feel it should have wrapped up 10 minutes earlier than it did. There's something about its final reveal that took away from the message it seemed to be conveying. What ends up happening definitely makes for a bleak and memorable finale, but the film's whole thesis dissipated in that moment for me. I still thoroughly enjoyed my time with Saltburn, I just wished the ending went in a different direction. I always appreciate an intimate, small-scale film where the characters are the focus, and Moonrise Kingdom is pretty much the embodiment of that. It's a movie about innocence, maturity, and rebellion at a time in our lives where we decide to turn against those who are only trying to protect us. There's something universal about childhood disobedience, where we all felt like we knew better than the adults, despite clearly having no concept of what something like love even is. But for Sam and Susie, it's real, so we should treat it like it is. Bruce Willis and Frances McDormand do a great job of portraying characters that are friendly and likable, but still clearly haunted by some unconfirmed past trauma. To contrast with this, the cast of kids, led by Scoutmaster Edward Norton, adds a light, energetic feel to the film which results in a warm and cozy tone overall. It's a film that has serious undertones yet always feels light-hearted, and I think that works in its favour. However, I think this is one of those movies where Wes's signature directing style actually gets in the way. Where it totally fits the theme and aesthetic of the Grand Budapest Hotel and Asteroid City, it only worked to pull me out of this story to remind me who was behind the camera. That might be a me thing and won't bother anyone else, but it was something that did stick out to me. Aside from that, Moonrise Kingdom is a joyous 94 minutes that will stay with me for a good while. The number 23 has a really interesting premise that could have been handled in a super interesting way had it been written by a better writer and handled by a better director. But as it stands, the film simply butchered the payoff to its intriguing setup. The story follows Walter, a man who finds a fiction book where the story seems eerily similar to his own life, and the number 23 seems to materialize everywhere he looks. The wasted potential is what bothers me most here. This could have been a captivating character study on a man's obsession with patterns, but in the end we got a typical thriller with clunky dialogue and a predictable twist ending. Lines like, "The number lives to kill another day," take what would otherwise have been a slow descent into a disturbed man's mind, and shifts the whole thing into a silly story that basically falls into parody. It pains me to say this because I can tell Jim Carrey was trying and I genuinely believe he cared about this story, but the melodramatic writing and the fact that it was edited like an Evanescence music video fully cement the thing in the 2000s in the worst way possible. I'm sure people will watch this and think I'm being too harsh, but for me, it honestly boils down to, what was the point of this story? When I can't answer that question is when I start to wonder if it was even worth my time. So the deciding factor in watching this involved a random number generator and a friend's parents' DVD collection. Enter Buster, a film I'd never heard of, but considering that the alternatives could have been Twilight or Cheaper by the Dozen, I counted myself lucky. Unfortunately, Buster is just a super boring film. You'd think the novelty of having Phil Collins in here would add a charm or novelty to it, but he's just not a very good actor. I mean, he even did the soundtrack. What was it that pulled Phil Collins, of all people, to this project? Julie Walters and Larry Lamb are also here, except they both do a much better job with what they're given. I believe that they are their characters, and Walters especially adds a much needed warmth to the film. She seems to be our emotional anchor in this story, and it's crazy to me how director David Green crafted a film that details the lives of the criminals behind the Great Train Robbery, but made that event far less interesting than the life of a working-class married woman from the East End of London. The film also just looks bad. I know that sounds a little vague and maybe petty, but there were several instances of artifacts in the film stock, like hairs in the gate and just a ton of grain. There were even a few shots that were obviously out of focus in the center of the frame. I don't know how that happens in a professionally shot and distributed movie, but there we go. Raw follows Justine, a young girl from a family of vegetarians who is just starting vet school, where she's forced to eat raw meat for the first time. Soon after, she begins to get cravings that she must overcome for the sake of everyone around her. Raw has no issue with being as shocking or as gross as it needs to be in order to convey what it wants. It has its squirmish moments, but it's never done for shock value. It's done to get a genuine response from the audience and to put them in Justine's shoes. But what's noteworthy here is that the film never seems to judge or criticize her actions. In a way, the cannibalistic tendencies she tries to fight are reflective of maturity. Perhaps puberty is the metaphor, or maybe even one's sexual awakening. Justine is scared of what's happening to her. She's worried that she might turn into something else, which in a sense is something that each and every one of us has gone through. I suppose that Roar is actually a story about growth, reflection, and ultimately acceptance. It takes us a little while for us to truly figure out who we are and what it is we want from life. Independence is scary. No one wants to be the person who's singled out for being odd, but maybe accepting what makes you different is the first step to becoming comfortable in your own skin. It's so hard to decide on how I feel about this movie. On one hand, Mom and Dad is an incredibly entertaining, so bad it's good movie that is absolutely bonkers. On the other, it's an incredibly disjointed mess that flip-flops around, seemingly unsure of what it actually wants to be. The film is about a suburban community where one day all the parents decide to kill their children for seemingly no reason. It's got a really interesting premise, and with the way that certain sequences are handled, I could see this being a genuinely captivating story if approached with the sincerity it deserves. However, the movie's fragmented identity never allows it to embrace what it could be. The editing is hectic, making the action difficult to follow. The soundtrack is just confusing, with a mishmash of various styles and genres, none of which seem to fit, and an incredibly jarring pace that falls back on unrelated cutaways every 5 minutes or so. Nick Cage is clearly having a load of fun here and hamming it up in the exact way that only Nick Cage can. The violence is visceral, there are some really funny lines in here, and I never really knew where it was going. The final half hour or so was an absolute blast, even if the ending itself just seemed to happen. It didn't really have a conclusion, no catharsis, it just stopped. I suppose the easiest way to sum Mom and Dad up is that it's objectively a horrible film, but subjectively is a lot of fun when things eventually kick off. I wouldn't go as far as to say I liked it, but I'd still watch it again. And that's what I watched this month. There was a moment in November where I needed to rest for a while because I watched quite a few heavy films back to back, so I guess it's lucky that next month is December. But anyway, let me know what you watched this month, what do you think of the movies I saw, pop them down in the comments and I'll be sure to check them out when I can. Be sure to follow me over on Letterboxd to keep up with my film exploits, and thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time, bye bye.